we're going to start getting into the wish list now. And full disclosure, Lisa, I've got 26 players on my wish list for this January camp. And let's just sort of like continue to put the focus on this camp right now, because this is the one that's going to sort of set the tone for 2023 for this team moving forward in their journey to the World Cup.
It
And
does. Yeah.
I just am like I just am curious if perhaps 6 months from now, when we, maybe look at our wish list here, or, when we do our official reaction to the roster drop for this January camp, how many of these players are going to be on that final roster for the World Cup? And I think this 6-month window is already going to confirm some things that perhaps some of us might already know or have an inkling of. So what we're going to do is we're going to go by position in this one. And of course, we're going to start with goalkeepers and defenders here. When I was putting together my January camp wish list, I pretty much was thinking of players that I plan on seeing with this pool of players and this coaching staff for the rest of the next 6 months. So you might see some names on here and you might say, Sandra, is that like really logically possible here to have included some of these players on this list? And I'm going to make that case for yes, but you might not see that in this goalkeeper position right here, because these are all players that I feel like you might agree with to a certain extent. For me, of course, I'm going with Alyssa Nair. There's Casey Murphy, and I'm also going with Adi Franch for the goalkeeper pool in the January camp wish list. How about you?
I love this, Sandra. I mean, when we do our wish lists and our rosters, sometimes we just align head to head. And that's exactly what we're doing, because I've also got 26 players on my roster. I also have some people on my roster that some may say, hey, are you sure you want to bring them? What's happening here? But I'm looking at the long game for Vlatko Andonovski and for the United States. And I want there to be 26 players in this camp, because this isn't the World Cup roster. This is the preliminary World Cup roster. And for my goalkeepers, I am 3 for 3 with you. I have Alyssa Nair, Casey Murphy, and AD Franch. I think when you look at Nair, I mean, that's a shoo-in. Casey Murphy has also gotten a lot of consistent time last year. She also kind of elbowed out Aubrey Kingsbury a little bit and solidified her spot as that number 2 goalkeeper. And then Vlatko Andonovski bringing back in Adriana France after her stellar season with Kansas City Current in the NWSL, and a player in France that has a lot of international experience. She's been in these positions before. That's exactly who you want as rounding out that third goalkeeper trio. And I think heading into this camp, Nair is still the number 1, but between France and Murphy, I think that number 2 goalkeeping position is up for grabs. And I'm excited to see kind of who will play between those two against New Zealand in January.
I'm with you. It's not so much that it's like, okay, so these are the 3 goalkeepers that we're going with for this January camp. And maybe that's probably that's likely to be the more predictable of the positions, right? Because it's only 3 that you were.
And there's only 3.
There's only 3 that we're selecting and going with. But I think that window of games, the 2 games against New Zealand, is where we actually are going to pay a little closer attention to this goalkeeper position, because like, who's going to get the starts in either of these games, and how is that going to, what is that going to look like for the coaching staff when they are having not just 1 but 2 games against the same opponent, right? So who's are we going to see 45-minute shifts? Are we going to just see start for start swap? I don't know. We'll see. We'll probably pay a little bit closer attention to that as the games get closer. But let's chat a little bit about defenders and who we would like to see along the defender core going to New Zealand for the January camp. And of course, I've got like 10 defenders on this.
I'm excited to hear who you have for these defenders, because there's people that you can choose from that whose names haven't been on the roster in a while.
Oh, 100%. And I got to tell you right now, there's absolutely going to be those players for me on this camp. I've got Crystal Dunn, Becky Sauerbrunn, Alana Cook, Naomi Girma, Sofia Huerta. I've got Emily Fox. I've got Haley Mace on there as well. because I just feel like she was someone who slotted in very late into the year for this national team camp. And I think that they're likely to keep her along for some more opportunities with this team. But I've also got amongst this core, I've got the return of Kelly O'Hara and I've got the return of Emily Sonnet along this defending core. So I just think at this point, there's certain players who have been with this team over the last year that are going to remain part of this player pool that the coaching staff continues to make their selections from. And my hope is that until they have to absolutely submit their final roster to the World Cup, that they're still going to continue to call in a lot of these usual suspects. Because maybe it's not necessarily about that cohesion anymore for some of these players who have played together for some time, but it will be perhaps for some players who have been missing for a little while. So when we're looking at players like Tierna Davidson, who was out all of 2022, is back in training. She's with Wolfsburg, apparently getting some training in before having to potentially go to a January camp, right? We have to take a look at and see obviously where she's at in her progress, but these next 6 months are also going to mean that some of these players who have been part of this program for some time still have to get reacclimated if they've been out with injuries. So for me, that includes someone like a Tierna Davidson, that includes someone like an Emily Sonnet, that includes someone like Kelly O'Hara. And I just think when it comes to more veteran players, it's so funny to like even think in my head and talk about somebody like Tierna Davidson as a veteran, but because she's still so young of a player. But this is a player that already has won a World Cup, that has already had the experience of going through preparing for a World Cup with the senior women's national team. So I am sort of considering her as one of those more veteran players because of that experience behind her, not so much because of her age. But those players, I think those more veteran players who have had that experience with the team, as we start to see 2023 progress, we're going to see the return of more and more of those veteran players into this pool of players. So defenders, I will say this. It's the biggest amount of players that I've got on my on my 26 wish list.
Well, it's just because we love the defenders so much, frankly, right? Like, so I have very similar defender list to you, but not identical by any means. Naomi Girma, Emily Fox, Alana Cook, Becky Sauerbrunn, Crystal Dunn, Sophia Huerta. I also have Tierna Davidson making her return to this roster. I'm hoping that she's available to actually play in a game, right? And compete in tackling and touch soccer, essentially, as it goes, contact soccer. I also have Kelly O'Hara still on this roster. She should be back from dealing with her injuries, as well as Sonnet. I think that Sonnet's a player, Emily Sonnet, that Vlatko Andonovski is going to keep around because she has been there and she has been in this. So for me, I don't have quite as many as you. I don't have Haley Mace on my roster, but I've got Girma, Fox, Cook, Davidson, Sauerbrunn, O'Hara, Huerta, Sonnet, and Dunn. I think that Crystal Dunn is a player that we saw come back slowly. Well, she came back quick, but then get a few minutes slowly at the end of 2022, playing against Germany for the United States in their most recent pair of friendlies that they just played in November. And she got minutes there. So I imagine that he'll continue to build her up throughout this January camp and the time in New Zealand. But some of the players I'm most excited for is Girma and how Naomi Girma can play alongside someone like a Tierna Davidson. That's a duo that I am just itching and dying to see.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if we'll see it in this January camp. I mean, we don't even know if they're on the roster, but I think that in training for them to be able to play with each other and get those minutes just in practice and being in the same camp together is going to be really, really beneficial for both Davidson and for Girma. So that's the pairing that I am so excited to see. And then you throw in a Becky Sauerbrunn there who's going to help give them that leadership and those skills on a big trip like this leading into a World Cup year. I mean, she's got the experience because she's been able to do it so long. And I mean, Davidson too, right? She's on the verge of 50 caps or so, right? She's been with the U.S. senior national team since 2018. She's got like 48, 49 caps at this point. So a veteran. I'm calling Davidson a veteran as well.
Yeah, no, I just at this point with 6 months, leading up to the biggest stage in the world, I don't think you don't look at someone like Davidson and not consider her that at this point. It's fun. Again, it's funny. We could say that about a few players in this player pool because despite being very young in age, some of them have already won a World Cup. Some of them have already played in multiple international tournaments at this point. And some of them have, more caps than some others who might be involved in this pool. But I think it's a very important note that you mentioned about, having players in this camp, but will we see them, participate in some of these actual friendlies against New Zealand? And I think with this camp, I think it's very important to note that, because for me, when I was putting together this 26 player roster, I was also the mindset where I'm just like, we actually might not see some of these players play. So will we see that continuity where there's like, hey, here's our 26 player roster or training camp roster, but we will only be dressing like 23 for these games, like that's something that I think we're gonna try to take a look at when that release finally does drop for the official January camp roster. But for me, I was like in that was lingering in the back of my mind. I'm like, listen, I'm gonna go with 26 players, but I have a feeling they're only gonna dress possibly 23. Like there's a possibility that we might not see Tinder Davidson play until something like She Believes Cup. So
I know that's what I think as well, especially you with your 10 defenders. I've only got 9 here, but I agree. I'm not optimistic that we will see Davidson in games.
And that's why I've got Mace on my roster, because I don't know if we'll see Davidson actually play.
I don't even know if we'll see Sonnet, right? Like we don't know technically at this point the rehab and development of players like Kelly O'Hara, Emily Sonnet, Tierna Davidson I'm going to throw in there. But it has been stated that they should be available for this camp. And even if they're not game ready, I think that those 3 will still be involved. But again, like if we don't see them play in the minutes and they are on the roster, like I wouldn't be too surprised about that, especially Davidson. Like you want to wean a player like that back in and not throw too much at her.
100%. Well, let's keep our fingers crossed. We won't know until we know. But for now, very early January 2023, A3, we're manifesting a Davidson Germa duo and look at those two. We want to see it.